This is Troubleshooting Apple School Manager. We are joined by Brian Hengels, Matt Abley, Tyrone Lutke, and Christopher Ball, and they're going to be talking about what they've learned from their various experiences as Jamfs with Apple School Manager. So I'm going to hand this off to Matt.
Thank you, Katie. Everybody excited? Woo, woo, yay. Last session of the day and of JNUC. Before we get started, just something for my little girl. If all of you would say cheese. Woo-hoo. Thank you. All right, so like Katie said, I'm Matt. Ty, Brian, and Chris all here with me. And our agenda today, Troubleshooting Apple School Manager. So what we're going to look at first is, I know a lot of you probably already have Apple School Manager in your Jamf Pro server already, but for those of you that don't or just want to get a better feel of things, we're going to go over how Jamf Pro integrates with Apple School Manager and what that looks like. Then what we're actually going to do is something that a lot of people haven't seen, the back-end working of syncing and importing. So we're going to take a look at what that actually looks like in the database itself. Then we're going to go ahead and go into common issues that everybody calls us up in support for. So we've got a good repertoire of common issues for you guys. And then we'll do a little bit of a bonus session into Apple Classroom, how that integrates with Apple School Manager, dealing with the EDU profile with that, and then at the end we'll have some time for questions here.
Thanks. Okay, so first thing, if you are interested in the program and have not currently enrolled for it, you'll need to do so by going to school.apple.com. Once you're enrolled, you can take your public key from your Jamf Pro server and use it to acquire a new DEP token, which will be used for synchronizing Apple School Manager data to your Jamf Pro. We recommend using an empty token for this purpose with no device assignments. This will help make sure that your Apple School Manager sync does not impact any current or future DEP workflows you have. After we have our token, we'll set up a new DEP instance in Jamf Pro. We'll also set up a new Apple School Manager instance within the Apple Education Support and mobile device settings. Whenever you're setting up this instance, there's some nuance regarding naming conventions, desired sync times, and criteria for matching users, which I'll try to demonstrate on this next slide. Okay, so first thing that you'll want to do is give your instance a name. This is just a friendly name, so choose anything you like. Something that makes sense to you and your colleagues if you have multiple people working in the system. Second step, we are going to select our DEP instance. This will be the instance that we created for using with Apple School Manager. Once again, no device assignments associated with this token. Next, we have our first major decision point. Are we going to synchronize information from Apple School Manager automatically? And if so, when are we going to, how often will we do it, and what time of day? Frequency could be something like daily, weekly, bi-weekly, or monthly, while time of day could be any hour on the hour that you choose. We just recommend that you avoid times that are being used by other Jamf Pro tasks, like backing up your database or flushing logs. After we have our sync time set, we will then need to determine the naming convention we're using for our courses. Something like course name or course followed by course ID. Once again, choose what makes sense to you and your colleagues. This is something you can change later, but it's good to determine upfront what you would like. Last, but certainly not least, we do want to determine the criteria we use for matching users who are imported from Apple School Manager into your Jamf Pro server. For example, you could say, if an imported user's managed Apple ID contains a Jamf Pro user's username, we will match those two, and roster data will be appended to the existing user. If no match is made, a new user will be created instead.
All right, so we talk about syncing and importing a lot, and a lot of people don't really understand what it looks like in the background for a sync and an import. So it's important to note the difference between the two. First off, when you sync information, you're bringing information from Apple School Manager into your database in Jamf Pro. So that populates all your roster tables. Now that doesn't mean that your users and classes are now in your Jamf Pro instance where you're able to then use them. That's where the import takes place. And what happens with an import is your roster table information is linked to other object tables in your database. So to give you all a sense of what this looks like, I've got a couple videos that will walk through on what it looks like during a sync in the database and what it looks like during an import with the database. So first off here, we're going to go into our settings and our Apple Education support. We'll click into our Apple School Manager instance. We'll see that right now it has not synced at all. We have our settings here set up, so everything is ready for a sync to take place. It just hasn't happened yet. So in our database, we're going to check out our roster tables. So roster user. As you can see, all of them are empty. So a sync has not taken place. We don't have information. So let's go ahead and force a sync now. And the awkward waiting. All right, so our sync took place. Now let's take a look at what happens in the database. We'll refresh the information, and you can now see that we have information populated in all our roster tables that was grabbed from your Apple School Manager instance. All right, so that takes care of the sync. So that's only the first step for the entire procedure. So next we do import. So let's see what happens when we import users with the database. So we'll see we've got our sync that took place, and we'll check out in our roster users table, we've got a -1 for a user object ID. That means that they are not tied to any existing user yet. So to make that take place, we're going to go into our users tab. We're going to do just a blank search to get our import. We'll click into our import. Want to assign it to a site. We'll go ahead and grab all of our users. Got a couple to match. And of course the review screen, which everybody reads over thoroughly. And we'll go ahead and hit next to import all the users. So what this is doing now is that's making the connection in your roster database tables to your user object table. So as soon as this is done, we'll pop back over into the database and see what that looks like. So now everybody with the -1 will refresh, and now we can see that there's a user object ID associated for all of these users. So that's how we make the tie between the roster table and our user object table. So we'll go ahead and look for one particular user, bring up John Snow. We can see that 1371 is his user object ID. So if we were to go into your Jamf Pro, bring up user 1371, we'll see John Snow with his user information with associated roster information for him. Now we'll take a look at the same thing, except this time we're going to look at what takes place with classes. Again, we've got the sync that took place, but now we're going to take a look at our roster class table. You can see in here that we have our roster IDs for the classes. So we're going to go into our classes tab, and we're going to do an import here. So this one is going to work a little differently. We're still going to make a connection between our object table, in this case being classrooms, and our roster class table, which brings in the ID. So you can see I've got two manually created classes without an associated roster ID, which was shown by the NA for source. We'll go in here and we'll grab about 6 of them to import. Hit next, check out the review screen like always, make sure everything looks good. and we'll go ahead and import. And now what this is going to do is not only are we bringing these classes in with the rostered class integration, but now they show in our classrooms table with an associated roster class ID that brings the link between the roster class table and our classrooms table. So we can see here, if we look at 434 in our classrooms table, that's going to associate with all this mumbo jumbo of the roster information for that particular class.
All right. So one thing that's a little confusing is what happens after the user is imported. Like, where does this information come from? So this page here shows the user object table. So this is the normal user that's always in your Jamf Pro server if you have any user. This is under the user object table. That's where this information is stored. If you're doing a match, it doesn't edit this information. This information is going to stay exactly the same. Nothing's going to change on this. The only time it's going to do anything with this information during an import is if you're creating a new user. And then it's going to pull the information over. The username is going to be your managed Apple ID before the @ sign. The name comes from the first, middle, and last name from Apple School Manager. And the email address is a little confusing. A lot of people think that it's the email address from Apple School Manager, but it's actually the managed Apple ID. And if there's a portion of it that has Apple ID dot in it, it drops that portion. It signs that to the email address. It's something we did a while back because the email address wasn't a field we could pull from Apple School Manager. So we had to put something in there because it's a required field in Jamf. Did I say JSS? I'm trying really hard not to say JSS, but anyways, so the user, that pulls in there because we couldn't get the email address from Apple School Manager. So then here you got the roster tab. This is the information that came from Apple School Manager. This is the stuff that's in your roster user table. This is what is going to update if you were to update this user later. So during a sync, this is the information that's going to come from Apple School Manager and update. Anytime you've already had the user in Jamf Pro, it's not going to edit that stuff we just went through previously. So it might change this information to continue with what's in Apple School Manager, but it's never going to change the information that's on the user tab. The only way to do that is to either do it manually or delete the user and re-import it. All right, so now that we've been over the communication and integration part, let's take a look at some of the common issues encountered and the resolutions for those. So one of the biggest issues we got here is duplicate users. Lots of people call in duplicate users. So the main thing is to check when are you getting these duplicate users. So during your import steps, you have that review screen. And you should be going through that review screen to see if you have anything that doesn't look normal that's coming from Apple School Manager. If during that import you have duplicates, if you have duplicate users during that, one of the things is that you could have duplicates in the database. We'll go over that on the next slide here. Excuse me. And then the other thing is check Apple School Manager for duplicates, because if you're importing from Apple School Manager and you have duplicates there, you may have those over in Apple School Manager as well. So you want to check over there and see if you have 2 of all your users or just the ones that are showing up. Clearing out roster tables, that's kind of something that if you have duplicates in the database, we might have to do. I'm going to go over that a little bit on the next slide as well. So then after your import, are you seeing duplicate users after that? So everything looked great during your import review, and you're coming in and you see, oh, now I got duplicate users that are actually in my Jamf Pro now. The main thing, check matching criteria. Check to see if your matching criteria is set up. Did they match the users? Like, I believe we went over that on a previous slide. Yeah. So check to see if that's correct and put in that information and see if maybe they just didn't match. Because if they didn't match, it's going to create new users. So you're going to end up with duplicate users. And then, the other thing is, did you manually fill in roster info? If you filled in roster information manually, you only can do this if they're not linked to Apple School Manager. You could do it ahead of time, but you can't match users if there's already information in that roster table. It won't match up. Even if you're the one that put that information in there, you can't, it might show that it's gonna match them up, but it won't. It's gonna create a new one. That's another instance where we might have to clear out your roster tables. I suggest reaching out to support for something like that. We have a lot of good workflows for clearing those out. And then when it comes to duplicate users, 9101.0, anything above that, is going to not allow users to have the exact same name, which is something that we had previous to this, and it caused lots of other issues. If you have duplicate users and you upgrade to 9101, or you're importing after that, it's going to append a -1, -2, whatever, how far it goes to that username. So that way you don't end up with the actual duplicate users that, like I said, there's a few product issues that if that happens, you can cause problems down the road. So if you end up having duplicate users, I definitely recommend reaching out to support if you can't figure out why they're in there, because we need to get rid of them. All right, so I talked about duplicates in the database. One of the things that can happen is if you have your DEP token selected in your Apple School Manager instance, and you went in there and changed that DEP token, it's gonna treat it as a whole nother instance, but it's gonna leave the information from the first one. This is a product issue, so it should be addressed at some point, but currently it's in a state where it leaves that information in the database and doesn't delete it. So what we recommend is if you're gonna change the DEP instance that you're using for Apple School Manager, go ahead and delete out your integration and recreate a new integration. It's gonna do the same thing that it would have done if you changed it, but it's gonna get rid of that data in the database from the old DEP token. Oh, and then we got the command here, select distinct DEP ID from roster user. That command you can run to find out if you have more than one DEP associated with your information in the roster. If you do, chances are this is what happened. It got changed. The one thing is you got the DEP ID equals -1. That's if information is either manually filled in or if you disconnected or if you deleted that DEP instance. So say originally I had one DEP in there and I changed it and then deleted that first DEP instance, it's gonna show a -1 for that data. If you have that, I would recommend reaching out to support because we're probably gonna have to manually clear out the roster data from the tables if you get to that point. All right, and if you do delete out your integration at any point to do some troubleshooting, sometimes we delete out the integration and reconfigure it. And just like we said before, if you're gonna change the token, you delete it out. If you have any classes that have been imported, it's going to break that integration with them. So they'll switch to say NA here because they're not synced to Apple School Manager anymore. So we'll wanna actually delete out those classes. And we have a good script in support that can delete those out for you. SIS importer does it. If you don't have a lot, you can do each one manually. But I would recommend, again, if you have a lot of them, you can reach out to support. We got a script in the SIS importer.
All right. So another problem that can occur is the sync status can be stuck in the pending status. So the syncing is a background process within the server that if you see that status say pending for a long time, because typically it should be pretty quick, that's something you might want to look into. And so one of the things you can do is to check the roster tables that Matt had mentioned earlier. See if you are getting any information synced in. If it's stuck, if no new information is coming in, you may need to restart Tomcat and then try it again. This will if there was a background process that was deadlocked or in some state where it couldn't continue, this should give it a chance to start again. Before you do sync again, you just check that table, kind of get a before state and then an after state. And then that last bullet point, ASM Sync Manager. This is something you can look for in the Jamf software server log. This is one of the classes that controls this background process. So it should have some, at a couple different log levels. I think if you have a debug on, it'll show you the starting and ending of that process, and it might give you some clues as to what else is happening in the background. So that's a starting point. We know there are a couple, speaking of product issues, a couple of product issues around this process being stuck still that we're looking into. So I guess contact support if there's a problem that isn't resolved through one of these steps.
So we found that a lot of headaches can come about during the import process. So we have some recommendations that can hopefully alleviate that process for you, maybe demystify it. First question that you might ask yourself before you perform an import is, are we planning to import all of our users from our SIS or Apple School Manager? If that answer is yes, we recommend that you perform the user import first before importing classes. This will give you the opportunity to verify the information, make sure that you don't have errors or duplicates, and if you need to delete things out, it's going to be a lot easier to do it at that time before classes are imported and then those users are linked to those classes. If you are not importing all users, we recommend importing just the classes. If you import only classes, any associated users that are in the roster, teachers or students, will also be added automatically. So once again, if you are not importing all of your users, you might not perform a user import at all. And this is only a recommendation, but we found that it does cause a little less headaches if you are very deliberate in the order. Another question that you might be asking, maybe not now, but 6 to 8 months from now, is what do we do for the next school year? And once again, we might just want to ask ourselves some questions. Has our user information changed at all? If it has, we'll need to re-import the users. Of course, any new users that you have will need to be imported as well. For classes, if your class information has changed, course name or course ID, for example, you'll need to delete the class and then re-import. What we recommend doing before the beginning of the year is go ahead and delete out all of your class data and then perform the re-import. That way you can make sure that all of your data is sounded up to date.
All right, one little addition we wanted to throw in here is auto-accepting VPP invitations. After you've done your import of users, they're now going to be tied to the managed Apple ID information. So this is an additional feature that we have available to us, is to be able to auto-accept user-based VPP invitations. This is really important for if you're doing ebook deployments, which we only can do for user-based. So this way, your managed Apple IDs don't have to get the invitation on a device. They can just automatically accept that invitation, and you can start deploying your ebooks to those users. The main thing is that you need to set it in the VPP account, I'm sorry, excuse me. The VPP account needs to be in Apple School Manager. You can't take a VPP account that's from either a different Apple School Manager than you have integrated or not tied with your Apple School Manager at all. The main thing is that the user, what you can check is the user that you sign into the VPP portal with, is that user in your Apple School Manager instance as a content manager. Chances are if it's able to log in with VPP and it's in Apple School Manager, it's probably a content manager. So the main thing is check Apple School Manager and see if that user is an account in there. If not, you can talk to Apple. They used to not be able to move them over, but I'm hearing rumors that they do move them over now, but don't quote me on that, even though I guess do quote me because it's on video. But so Apple, it sounds like they're able to move them over to Apple School Manager. If you heard that too, yeah. So once you know you have that in there, you can turn it on in the global VPP option. So when you go into the VPP settings, there's a checkbox that you have to go turn it on in there. And then once you check it globally, in the invitation, you have the option that you see here to go ahead and just accept the invitation right away. Actually, I said that backwards. This one is the global VPP option. But then you have the option in the invitation. You can select you want to auto accept it or not. So that's just an extra feature. Pretty cool.
Cool indeed. Another thing we'll touch on briefly, everybody or a lot of people now are moving into SIS integrations with Apple School Manager. Just touch on it where the integrations can vary between companies of SIS providers. So not everybody's going to have the same solution for an issue with Infinite Campus compared to PowerSchool compared to others. So make sure, especially if you started out with the SFTP uploads, to reach out to Apple before moving into your SIS integration, just to make sure everything's going to transition fine, where you're not going to get duplicate users from your SFTP and your SIS, because then that will trickle down into your Jamf Pro server. We'll have to fix it there and then go back and fix it in your Apple School Manager instance as well. Another thing that people are seeing with their SIS is Apple School Manager is not selective in taking that information. It will grab everything out of your SIS provider and throw that into Apple School Manager, which for most people is fine. But if you're a school district that maybe you've only got a few schools that you want to use Apple School Manager with, this probably isn't going to be the best option because you're going to be overloaded with data that you don't need, which will then again come into your Jamf Pro and essentially could create some issues for you there. So a little bit of a bonus here. We're going to look at Apple School Manager and how it interacts with Apple Classroom. One of the things to make note of is you do not need one to have the other. You can definitely do Apple Classroom without the need to integrate with Apple School Manager. Apple School Manager is a great way to import your classes and users into Jamf Pro to use. But another caveat of that being, if you were using shared iPad, you would need to use Apple School Manager in combination with Apple Classroom. So next we'll go through the best slide you guys will ever see at JNUC with my handy dandy flow chart. So if we're looking at Apple Classroom deployment and Apple School Manager, we're going to start in Apple School Manager. We'll create our users and classes there, and then we'll go ahead and import those into Jamf Pro. In Jamf Pro, we're going to go ahead and enable Apple Education support, and this is the function that will allow your Jamf Pro server to push out the EDU profile to your devices, which is needed in order to use Apple Classroom. Jamf Pro will then send out the EDU profile out to your devices where they'll be ready to now use Apple Classroom. I know, it didn't disappoint. So deploying the EDU profile, just some things to make note of. If you are a teacher device, you got to make sure that that device is not shared. One of the stipulations of a teacher device is that it cannot be enabled into shared mode. That teacher then needs to be in a class in Jamf Pro and also connected to a device in Jamf Pro. When that association is made, Jamf Pro then knows to send the EDU profile to this teacher that is associated to this device. The same thing exactly for one-to-one students, where again they need to be in the class and that user also needs to be associated to a device. Shared, it's different. Shared iPad, you need to make sure you've got a mobile device group associated to the class. That's the only way your shared iPad will get the EDU profile is via a mobile device group. So if for some reason you're expecting to get an EDU profile deployed and you're not getting it, check these prerequisites and make sure that everything makes sense logically where your user is attached to the device and Jamf Pro knows where to send that EDU profile.
All right. So I'm going to talk a little bit about basically the events that can cause that EDU profile to be deployed or changed and redeployed. This might be useful to know if you're seeing delays in these going out or some other issues related to the deployment of that profile. These are the events that either you or the other admins could do that would cause these events to happen. So if you update or delete a class itself, obviously that can affect the setup that needs to occur on that device. So that's one event. Updating or deleting the groups that either device or user groups that are used to create that association for the classrooms. Updating or deleting the devices themselves, users, and then if you do have the user images settings set up, changes you make to that will also trigger a redeployment of this EDU profile. And that profile is used to basically set up trust and association between the student and teacher devices, so that we need to keep an eye on these events and make sure that the right association is delivered to the right device. So these are the events that would cause a redeploy if you're seeing any problems with that profile showing up on those devices.
All right, so classroom app. Here's a little screen right here that happens sometimes. If you open up the classroom app and you see this screen, chances are the EDU profile is either not on the teacher device or it's not updated or it's corrupt in some way. The EDU profile, the classroom app is going to look for that EDU profile, and if it doesn't find it, it's going to come up with this screen. This is a little bit older. Currently, if it's downloaded straight from the App Store, it would come up with the option to be able to set it up as a teacher and manually create classes. So for the most part, I've still seen this, so I think it has to do with the EDU profiles not being fully up to date. So what you want to do is first check to see if the device has the EDU profile. You can go into the Jamf Pro, the device record in Jamf Pro, and you can go and look to see if it's a management command that is either pending, failed, completed. You want to see if you have that EDU profile out. You can also check it in the settings of the device under the profiles. If this is happening as well, you also want to check the prerequisites. Does your device meet the minimum requirements to be able to use the classroom app? This is available from Apple. If you just search for classroom help, there's Apple Classroom Help. There's a help page that will give you all the prerequisites that you need. And yep, I covered the management tab and history. So. All right, so this is the other screen, manually created classes. This means this is what you would see if you were to just load it up and you don't have the teacher assigned to any classes in Jamf Pro. So basically, you cannot manually create classes and have them assigned to classes in Apple School Manager. If I were to go, in Jamf Pro. If I were to go and manually create classes on my device as a teacher, and then I were to go add that teacher and their device to the class, it's going to overwrite any of their manual classes that they had already in there with the ones from Jamf Pro. You need to have iOS 10.3 or above to be able to use this feature. If you don't, this screen won't even come up. You'll get that screen we were looking at before. And then the students need to be in Bluetooth proximity so they can join the class. Just in 9.101.0, we have a restrictions profile that'll make it so, or two restriction profiles that'll make it so the student doesn't have to accept the class anymore. So basically, if they have that restriction profile and the student invites them into the class, they're just put into it. They don't get a prompt, and they don't have to go through all the workflow of adding themselves to the class. If you have any questions about that, feel free to reach out to support on that as well. All right. boom. Yeah, any questions, feel free to come up to the mics and we'll try to answer them.
Question about the manual created classes. Are those classes that were created in the JSS outside of Apple School Manager? Is that what you mean by manually created classes?
Correct, exactly. If have you used Casper Focus at all before?
Yeah.
Yeah. So the classes that are in Jamf Pro that basically you could look at the classes list, and if it has NA next to the Apple School Manager, that's considered a manually created class.
Okay, so those won't create a EDU profile. Okay.
No, I get the confusion. So what Ty was mentioning before, the manually creating classes for Apple Classroom, they're more of, I guess we could consider ad hoc classes. So those would be different than any classes that you have listed in your Jamf Pro. So these are just directly created through Apple Classroom.
Is this on? Hello? Yeah, I might have missed it earlier, but I was wondering if you can go back to that slide, how to determine which one, because you said on Jamf 9.101, you put there's automatic / added if it's duplicate. So is that the dash? Is that the one that's coming from Apple School Manager, or the one that's already existing in JSS?
I know what you're, so the one that's coming from Apple School Manager is usually if there's a duplicate managed Apple ID, and that's all on Apple's, on their side with that. What this is you'll have a username in Jamf Pro, -1, -2, -3. It's just the username that gets that appended to it. So it's different than what you might see on Apple School Manager's side if you've got duplicate managed Apple IDs. This is now Jamf Pro's way of basically flagging these as duplicates.
Yeah, because I'm seeing a lot of those, and I'm wondering how you can, because on the duplicate side, I have assigned laptops. On the one that's coming from ASM, I need to assign them to iPad, obviously, so it can receive the EDU profile. So is there like a mass?
So what that usually comes down to is the matching criteria. It might not have matched when you imported the user from Apple School Manager. It might not have matched to your current user that's assigned the device. So it created a new user. So you have a user assigned to a device, and you have a user assigned that's syncing with Apple School Manager. I would definitely recommend reaching out to support if you want some help trying to figure out what matching criteria would work, or if there's any things that we can do to try and get those users to match. Generally, what we end up doing is we'll go and we'll delete all the users that have the dashes in them, and then re-import them with the correct matching criteria.
I see. Second question is you cannot use on Apple Classroom. You said you cannot use the teacher-created classes if you have an EDU profile. So is it possible to use Apple Classroom and Casper Focus, just in case, if you need to teach a student that's not, like a custom class?
I wouldn't see why not, because really the big limitation of that is the EDU profile, and Casper Focus does not base theirs on an EDU profile. So even if you use Casper Focus, I would just make sure that the box isn't checked for enabling Apple Education support. That'll prevent the EDU profile from going out, and you would still then, yes, be able to use Focus with that.
I mean, you cannot use it side by side. I mean, can you use it side by side? Can you use Classroom and?
I would assume you could. I haven't tried it, but if you wouldn't need the EDU profile, and that's the big thing that keeps the ad hoc classes from also being in combination with the managed.
All right, thank you.
Yeah.
Hello. When you first import the classes from Apple School Manager, how do they get assigned to sites?
Yes, that is a good question. Right now, in the import screen, it does have it where you can select a site to import the classes into. I have yet to see that work. I believe we've got something filed on that where it's not respecting the import to assign it to a site, which is, I can imagine, be very frustrating, where you'll have to go back after the fact to assign those.
If you're in the site, when you make the import,
Mm-hmm.
they go into that site.
Do they? Okay.
Yep, so basically I do multiple imports, so I search by the school location and the name of the class, then I do an import for that school, and then I change the site in the actual site selector, and then do an import for the next school.
Okay. So what she said, if anybody didn't hear it, she changes the site of where she's at in Jamf Pro right now and goes through the import and selects to import into that site, and it does go into it. Now, as far as, you know, product issue wise, I would expect being able to do that in full access. So that's good to know that you can do that with that. But we should definitely be able to do that with a full access user.
Next question. If we have, let's say that a school says we would like to roster our classes through Jamf. We do that. For whatever reason, that model does not work for them, but now the Edu profile is pushed down to the teacher iPads. And they say, no, we want to do ad hoc classes now. By deleting the Jamf classes or deleting the teachers from the Jamf classes, what removes the Edu profile so they can now create ad hoc classes?
Yep, if you remove the teacher from all the classes that they're associated with, or the students from all of them, Jamf Pro will issue a remove EDU profile command for those.
It's the EDU monitor. There's an EDU monitor similar to like the VPP monitor and DEP monitor that continuously runs and is checking for that data. So when you remove that, the EDU monitor initiates that.
Okay.
Hi, real quick, I'm sorry if I missed it, but what is generally a best practice for mass deletion of classes right now?
You grade the script, so.
Either you could do a simple curl that has the range of your IPs. Support has a Python script that you can also run that will just loop through all of them and delete them all out. Otherwise, some people will use our SIS importer.
Yeah, I've tried using that in the past. What I found was it only deleted a couple hundred at a time.
Oh, really? Okay.
Yeah, and so you just have to do it again and again and again, and eventually it goes. But yeah.
Send us an email, and,
Sure.
and we can help you out with that for sure.
Okay, awesome. Thank you.
Yeah.
Hey, so this might be kind of a loaded question, but basically right now we still use the SIS importer, and we have Classroom working in every class, our whole district using that. But we do have that PowerSchool integration now with ASM, so we kind of want to switch to that, especially for the ebooks, VPP stuff, and all that we can use. Currently, everything's working though. So what's the workflow that I would go through to set it up in there and start the sync from ASM instead of doing the SIS importer?
So what you'll need to do first is obviously delete out those classes
Right.
that were imported through your SIS importer. As soon as that takes place, really what you can do is, if you haven't yet created that empty DEP token just to use for syncing, and really to kind of give you an overview of why we do that is you could use any DEP token you would like, but what we've noticed is it's nicer to have, you know, the token with all your devices separate than the token that you're using for syncing user and location, user and class information, just because there has been some instances where maybe you need to remove the DEP token with devices out of Jamf Pro and re-add it in for some reason. Well, if that's associated with your classes, now all of a sudden you broke that link between Apple School Manager and your Jamf Pro, and you're going to have to end up redoing all your classes. So I would create that token first, and then it's just going to be as simple as doing a sync, bringing that into those roster tables that we showed, and then just a straight up import.
So it won't mess up like right now. Basically, all of my student devices are assigned based off their AD credentials that they sign in to set up their device. All those users are already in the JSS. Whenever I do all that stuff in Apple School Manager to create all those Apple IDs and those users, I saw a lot of duplicate stuff. I've never had to deal with that before. Is that going to merge that to those users, and I won't have to change the user associated with the device?
biggest thing I would say is make sure when you create the naming convention for your managed Apple IDs, keep that the exact same as what you have for your existing Jamf Pro users.
Okay.
That's going to be the easiest saving of time for you.
And I can do that with staff having different username convention than students, right?
Right.
Okay.
Yeah, and that's going to, like you said, basically merge them. It'll match the records and say this existing user gets this roster info now.
Oh, perfect. Okay, I'll give it a shot.
Yeah.
Okay, we'll take one more quick question. What would be the best avenue for anybody who is left with additional questions to get in touch with you?
We'll hang out here for a few minutes.
Okay,
Yeah.
one more.
This isn't actually a question. You were talking earlier about getting a previously made VPP account imported or transferred into Apple School Manager.
Yep.
If you, in Apple School Manager and under Settings, which is what, bottom left-hand corner, there's now a process you can go through that'll send an invitation to that VPP account where you can just manually import it, and it will become a content provider account.
Oh, that's really good to know.
It's just the VPP account has to have two-factor authentication enabled.
Okay, yep, that makes sense.
Apple helped me with that about a month ago, and I was very happy.
Yeah, that's a great feature. Yeah, that's good to know because in our test instance, we're kind of, we don't have a lot of availability of stuff to just throw around, so.
Thank you, Matt, Ty, Brian, and Chris. That's the end of JNUC 2017. Our friends here will be hanging out for a little bit, but thank you very much.